Welcome to the Neurocrush Immersion. In this podcast, we are exploring what shapes our religiosity. Is it purely a product of faith? Is there a role for the brain, for the mind, for culture? What about neurological and mental health conditions? Do they influence religious experiences? And is there something called normal religiosity? These are thought provoking questions, and we intend to look at what shapes human religiosity. Is it purely spiritual or is it deeply rooted in the culture? Does it come from the brain? Whether neurological and mental health conditions can influence these religious experiences? What is normal religiosity? How do we experience normal religiosity? Let's delve into these thought provoking questions. Most religions, most dictionaries, they describe religion as a way of life. Religious beliefs, practices, and experiences of individuals in our society appear to have a strong cultural basis in their evolution and have been described as part of every ancient civilization discovered and studied by modern man. On the face of it, therefore, it seems inconceivable that religious experiences may have a biological basis in the brain. We kind of think of religion as something that's part of culture, as part of society. But when one gets into a quest of this nature, there are really several unanswered questions. For example, ask yourself, why are some people intense in their religious beliefs and practices, and why are others considerably less enthusiastic? Or indeed, even during your own lifespan, why do your religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices probably change, sometimes progressing even from atheism to and agnosia to intense religiosity or spirituality? Can your social cultural experiences alone determine this, or are there more inherent biological determinants of such human behavior? Now, empirical observations do suggest that a simple socio-cultural explanation may be inadequate. For example, two siblings born in the same home, brought up in the same circumstances, can be widely differing in the way they approach religion or spirituality. In this circumstance, the socio-cultural ethos is a virtual constant. Yet, there are variations in the quality, frequency, and the intensity of religious experiences that are observed. And in a single family, it's not uncommon to witness an entire spectrum from atheism to intense religiosity in different members who have all lived under the same roof, who've considerably experienced the same circumstances for years and years. And therefore, while psychological and social factors unique to each one person may have a role to play, there are other possible explanations that could be biological and that could come from science, and that really is what we are talking about. Religiosity is therefore not just a belief, it encompasses spiritual experiences, cultural and communal rituals, moral and ethical frameworks that we tend to absorb and tend to believe in. It also exists on a spectrum from a personal spirituality, one person's practice, beliefs, and ideas, to institutional religion, where one practices religion as part of a whole community or as part of a very large spectrum of people. Neurology, interestingly, has its share of religious models. The Geschwind syndrome, named after the very famous Norman Geschwind, the father of behavioral neurology, is a personality syndrome that has been described in people with poorly controlled temporal lobe epilepsy or chronic temporal lobe epilepsy. In these people, the seizures arise repeatedly from the temporal lobes, and these are the oldest parts of the human brain and the nervous system. And if you draw a line between your ears, they exist in the middle on either side. Now, in Geschwind syndrome, a well-defined cluster of behavioral symptoms characterize this personality type. and they include intense hyper-religiosity with intensified preoccupations related to moral, philosophical, religious, or ethical themes. Indeed, the intensity is so often so great that the person finds it very difficult to disengage when they are confronted with a situation that involves one such theme. Now, why do people with Geschwind syndrome of temporal lobe epilepsy have such intensity of religious and spiritual experience is a question that's been asked. Baer and Fedio, two researchers, came up with a very interesting biological explanation for this. They pointed out that when you have temporal lobe epilepsy, there is ongoing electrical activity in the temporal lobe, and this results in all the information that you hear, that you perceive, being suffused with a deep emotional coloration. Now, let me give you a little bit more of an explanation for that. Your temporal lobes synthesize information, especially information that comes in an auditory fashion. And that information is correlated with what you have as your memory, and it also has emotional coloration because your memory center, the hippocampus, and your emotional center, the amygdala, are next to each other. They are neighbors and they constitute parts of the temporal lobe. So if you can imagine a person who has constant electrical activity or electrochemical activity of epilepsy in that part of the brain, everything that they hear, everything that they perceive can be deeply suffused with emotional coloration. And this was the hypothesis for why people develop a certain personality or a certain set of behaviors, and this was described as a hyperconnectivity of these critical brain structures. Perhaps the most dramatic description in popular science of the Geschwind syndrome comes in V.S. Ramachandran's book Phantoms in the Brain, and he has this chapter very evocatively titled God and the Limbic System, and he draws on his own experience to give us a description of the hyper-religious patient with temporal lobe epilepsy. He describes the dramatis persona complete with religious symbols and a prophetic fervor, accompanied by a firm belief in him that his life had special meaning and his existence a special purpose for the world we live in. And while Ramachandran's subject had symptoms that were decidedly exaggerated, which is a caricature rather than the norm, hyper-religiosity in people with temporal lobe epilepsy evolves over time. It's almost like a trait phenomenon, a personality phenomenon, as opposed to comes up suddenly, which is more a state phenomenon or a behavioral phenomenon. Ramachandran, in his chapter, poses the interesting question: is religiosity a predetermined biological trait? And if you paraphrase that question, you could ask, is there a God module in the human brain? So in other words, does a part of the human brain determine your religiosity, the type of religiosity, the extent of the religiosity, and the intensity of the religiosity? Now contrast this with psychiatric literature and what has been observed and described in people with mental health conditions. We know that in mania, a condition which is part of what we call bipolar disorder, where a person is prone for elevated and euphoric moods and in those phases has altered behavior, there is a religious ecstasy which they sometimes demonstrate. And this religious ecstasy is quite different from the almost prophetic fervor of the person with paranoid schizophrenia, where too we see religious ecstasy. In a depressed, anxious or avoidant individual, there is a certain amount of religiosity in some. It's almost a desperate plea for salvation. Whereas for the person with OCD, the religiosity may become part of the obsessive compulsive rituals. Or indeed, religiosity could become part of the magical realism and the magical beliefs of the person who has a schizotypal personality. So, different mental health conditions have different flavors of religious experiences and religious expressions that have been described and observed. There is also a variation in the quality and intensity. For example, what we see in mania is an acute hyper-religiosity, which is rather different from the grumbling, slowly evolving, almost prophet-like religious fervor of the person with a schizophrenia-like psychosis. So how it evolves, how quickly it emerges, how it presents itself, all contributes to the kind of mental health diagnosis that is being made about the individual. But what is common in many of these individuals is that underlying religious theme and that underlying expression of religiosity. Now, are these variations in phenomena, in quality and intensity governed only by psychological and socio-cultural determinants, or indeed do different brain mechanisms have a role to play in determining these variations? These are questions that we must keep asking ourselves. What we do know is that faith and spirituality are influenced by specific brain regions. The temporal lobe has been linked to mystical and transcendent experiences. The prefrontal cortex has been linked to moral reasoning and reflection, and what we call the default mode network to self-awareness and introspection. And we may safely conclude that faith is not something that's just in the heart, it's something that's wired into our brains. The brain structure and function is such that it can participate in the evolution of religious states. And as we've described, in temporal lobe epilepsy, for example, we do see intense religious visions and intense religious experiences, and a chemical that's important for happiness, for motivation and mobility, dopamine, is involved in a number of mystical experiences and in the production of euphoria, as we do know from the experience of people who use psychedelic substances. So in a sense, therefore, many things use brain pathways and brain structures to trigger or indeed to create religious experiences for humans. And as we've just pointed out, religious experiences are part of many psychiatric conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and OCD. What we also know is that personality traits do shape religious beliefs. The trait of openness, for example, is associated with mysticism and transcendence. The trait of conscientiousness, for example, to structured rituals. In a way, therefore, the way we experience religiosity and the way we express our religiosity is influenced by the kind of person we are. Emotions also have a role to play, with feelings like awe, fear, and gratitude deepening faith experiences. And indeed, when you reflect on your own experience or in your own observations of other people whom you may know, how they react to an elevated experience, for example, being in a very special religious place like a temple, a church, or a mosque, where they have aspired to be for years and years and years and finally reached there. Or indeed, being in a very special place, for example, a mountainous region, which is associated with religious or spiritual experiences. When people are in these circumstances, they are often very much more likely to experience or express these experiences and these emotions. And it's therefore very important to think about religiosity in all these different ways and contextualize it from all these different ways. When you think about religiosity, you have to also ask yourself, so what is normal religiosity and how do you define hyper-religiosity? And of course, this is something that is very subject to transcultural influences. We do know, for example, that in the Western world, participative religion is something that is considered to be slowly dying in society. On the other hand, in many Eastern traditions and communities, including ours in India, religion continues to be a very, very important part of everyday life. We did a survey where we asked a large number of people coming to a suburban railway booking counter about their religious beliefs and experiences. And in this survey, we found that about 70% of all people qualified as being religious or very religious. And this, of course, is quite commonplace in the Indian context. I mean, we have the ongoing Kumbh Mela, which is a very good example of how religiosity and spirituality are a very big part of human life in a country like ours. Now, when the way we defined hyper-religiosity in that survey was as being 2 standard deviations from the median score. And in this circumstance, very, very interestingly, we found only a very small number of people qualified as being hyper-religious. And one of the conclusions we reached was that because your baseline of average religiosity was high, it took a lot to qualify someone as hyper-religious. And therefore, one of the things that we have to consider is that depending on the society or culture we live in, the definition of what we would call normal religiosity is going to be very different from another culture where the norms are very, very different. We also know that religiosity can be a trait, as we said in temporal lobe epilepsy, it's part of the personality, or it can be a state, as we said, for example, in mania, where it's rather acute and comes on quite suddenly and can disappear with the disappearance of the mania. Now, in popular perception, we think that the personality develops, from childhood to adulthood, and then we kind of think that it stops developing. Nothing could be further from the truth. Most of our personalities continues to evolve right through our lives, and therefore religiosity as a trait can also evolve along with your personality as you grow. No surprise then that many people discover the trait closer to middle age, closer to their older lives, rather than when they are young. And from a socio-cultural perspective, one can perfectly understand why, with age, there may be a tendency to lean more towards religious or spiritual experiences. There is also one thing that we have to think about, that religiosity as a state phenomenon can be part of an evolving mental health condition. And sometimes what we pass off as normal can be the signs of an evolving mental health state. And this is something that we have observed in many patients who come to clinic with intense mental health symptoms, with a fairly long period before, where one of the very prominent symptoms was an accentuated religiosity which was not part of their normal. And this is something we have to think about. We had also a young person who became intensely religious in a very ritualistic kind of way for 2 or 3 weeks. And the parents were completely flummoxed because they did not practice religiosity in the same way. And this young man was also starting to ask a number of philosophical questions which seemed to be way beyond his age and way beyond his usual interests, and very, very different from his usual interests. It turned out that he had evolving epilepsy in his brain, and until he actually threw a seizure, we did not realize why this religiosity was happening. It was tied to a mental health experience, but indeed it was a neurological disorder like epilepsy that had been evolving in the person. And the other thing, of course, that we all have to keep in mind, that our religiosity is also influenced by what's going on in our lives. And during periods of adversity, we are much more likely to turn towards religion and God than we are in periods when everything is going extremely well. And that is part of normal human experience. The other thing, of course, to ask yourself is whether all this is just part of a normal psychological process, or is there an independent pathological process that is ongoing. From a psychological and socio-cultural perspective, a flight into hyper-religiosity may in many ways be more acceptable both to the person and to those around her or him than a flight into emotional distress. There is a certain acceptability about religiosity in many social circumstances that perhaps encourages people from a socio-cultural and psychological perspective to lean towards it. And of course, there are findings, however, today to tell us that religiosity may be biological. The God module. So there have been studies, including one in which I was personally involved, which has looked at various brain regions in people who were hyper-religious. And one area of interest that has come up in those studies is the right hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is the size of a small finger joint, and if you draw a line between your ears, it's on either side, right in the middle. It is the seat of your memory. It also happens to be the seat, the region of interest, both in temporal lobe epilepsy and in depression. Even in those people who don't have epilepsy, the hippocampus is a region of interest for depression. Now, very interestingly, the left hippocampus has been implicated in conditions like major depression and schizophrenia. But the right hippocampus is what seems to be implicated in during states of hyper-religiosity in people with temporal lobe epilepsy and in functional imaging studies in people experiencing hyper-religiosity. Now, we do know that the left side of our brain is the ideational, philosophical brain, and the right side of the brain is the emotional brain. This is something that it's a great generalization that I just said, but it is something that a lot of studies have supported. And it is therefore very, very curious that it is the right hippocampus that seems to be implicated in states of hyper-religiosity or in people in whom hyper-religiosity is a trait. Finally, the question that we have to also ask ourselves is that do these brain changes come first, and is our tendency to develop hyper-religiosity or hyper-spirituality an outcome of those brain changes, or indeed do these brain changes follow the development of hyper-religiosity or hyper-spirituality? And that really is the chicken and egg question. Which came first? Which is a question to which we probably do not have the answers at this point in time. However, if you take the World Health Organization approach of bio, psyche, social, and consider religiosity from that context, it may be safe to say that even if your psychological and social experiences have influenced you to develop an interest in matters of religion and spirituality, the biological determinant that decides how significant this is going to be for you may lie in your brain. And that is something that research is teaching us, and that is something that all of us need to consider. Culture, of course, molds our faith from childhood through stories, through rituals and communal practices. Most of us have been influenced, at least to some extent, by our culture in the way that we consider and the way that we participate in our religion. Religious traditions influence our emotions, influence our ethical values, and our daily behaviors. And one needs to ask the question, is belief therefore a cognitive adaptation to those circumstances, or is it indeed an emotional necessity of those circumstances? Religion, therefore, can be complex. It's safe to say that faith is an interplay between the brain, mind, and culture, that neuroscience, neurological disorders, and mental health conditions seem to have an influence on religious experiences, and perhaps the Almighty, therefore, is not just an external force, but something deeply embedded within us in more ways than one. There is a fine line between what we consider normal religious experience and what we consider an aberrant, abnormal, or hyper-religious experience, and how we distinguish mental illness in these ways. We do know that religious experiences can be either pathological, that they lead to a downslide for the individual in terms of their mental health, or indeed enlightening and uplifting, as we've discussed in the previous podcast about Jiddu Krishnamurti. And of course, we do have to ask ourselves the question, who decides what is a divine revelation or what is a delusion? And sometimes one has to be aware that it may not be right to be judgmental at any particular point in time. Religious experience and expression varies across cultures and individuals. What is considered a fervent act in one tradition may be extreme in another, and science, psychology, and philosophy all offer perspectives. The question is there a single truth that we can all lean on? And to extend this, we need to inquire, can science and faith coexist? And curiously, in many situations it does. There are people who are very accomplished in science who have great beliefs which are religious, spiritual or faith-based. And there are many scientists who have acknowledged the role of spirituality in human life. And therefore, it's probably safe to say that the brain seeks meaning, whether through religion or through scientific discovery. Ask yourself, what role does faith or spirituality play in your own life? How has your mind, your culture, your social experiences, your belief systems, things that you have learned, things that you have watched and imbibed, how have they shaped your beliefs? And what is the role of your brain in all this? Is it possible that faith is not entirely an external construct for many of the reasons we've talked about today? Is there a deep internal construct? Many historical figures through the ages have described or been described to have intense religious experiences. In India, apart from Jiddu Krishnamurti, whom we have dealt with, Sri Ramana, Sri Ramakrishna, and Rabindranath Tagore are people in whom religious experiences and spiritual experiences have been documented. The mindfulness research world has studied monks, meditators, and documented altered brain states in them. And one of the things that we have discussed in an earlier podcast also is about Carmelite nuns and what happens during their state of union with God. And then, of course, there is the subject of near-death experience and the unique commonality that seems to emerge in the very large number of people who have documented their near-death experience. Many of those experiences as documented are deeply spiritual, and the commonality is intriguing. So, is there then a God module in our brain? The evidence seems to suggest that our emotional brain, the limbic system, the hippocampus in particular, perhaps more on the right side, plays a significant role in determining the nature and quality of one's religious experience and expression. It's very likely that the rich neurochemical networks that populate this region, including dopamine and serotonin, have considerable influence on our religiosity, notwithstanding the alteration of the brain structure, the hippocampus, as we've talked about, the right hippocampal atrophy that's been described. Religiosity can therefore be viewed as a trait which can undergo both physiological and pathological evolution during the course of a person's lifetime. The nature of the underlying biological framework in an individual is likely to determine the form, quantum, and nature of religious experience and expression that psychological adversity and emotional illness provoke. So, to put it very simply, you have a certain biological network. You are shaped by certain experiences, psychological and social, and how you express religiosity or spirituality at any point in time is determined by your circumstances and the triggers and provocative factors at that point in time. And that's the biopsychosocial model of mental health that we need to rely upon. One must therefore, however, acknowledge our collective ignorance as a society about the biological, neuropsychiatric, and psychological effects and virtues of theism, atheism, and their many splendored and much debated interface. Whether our religious predilections have a role in protecting and preserving, or indeed enhancing our emotional state, remains thus a matter of conjecture. The influence of this God module in our brain, the Almighty within, is, however, like the way we conceptualize God, probably omnipresent, just as our ancients always thought. Strange then indeed are the ways of the Lord.